We know now about the use of napalm, the use of cluster bombs, the use of depleted uranium, and we know about the loss of life for Iraqi civilians in the first Gulf War in the tens of thousands. Tens of thousands also of military, many of them conscripts, killed at that time. But the difference was that the war was fought in order to bomb Iraq into compliance. And that's why it could be done as a technologist's war, because you didn't need to engage. So then we come to the current war, the invasion in 2003 and the current occupation of Iraq. Yes, firstly we must recognise that the bombing is still there. It's a different war, it's a more traditionalist war, because we have that engagement, the occupation, but let's not think that this means it's not a technological war as well. The bombing is still there, and we know that just last year there was a massive increase, 5 times as much bombardment, 5 times as much ordnance dropped on Iraq in 2007 than there was in 2006. Just in January of this year, the dropping of 50 tons of bombs in 10 days on the Arab Jabur neighbourhood of Baghdad, which was home to 120,000 people and at least 500 killed in that bombardment. So we've still got the same technological and dirty war, with the UN speaking out against that type of atrocity in civilian areas. But now we're also back to an old-style military occupation. And the military presence on the ground is because it's no longer about bombing a country into submission and compliance, it's about long-term control. And we know that this is going on at the moment in the Iraq talks of the security agreement, which, when the UN mandate runs out at the end of this year, is meant to provide for perpetual presence, indefinite leave to remain, if you like, for the US military in Iraq. We know that the reason behind much of this is the long-term push for oil. War on Want, we paid for a public opinion poll earlier this year asking the British public, what do you consider to be the #1 reason for going to war with Iraq? And we gave perfectly good options. We said, was it to remove Saddam from power? Was it out of concern of human rights of the Iraqi people? Was it for search of WMD? All of the official things and other things. It came out not just for one group, but for everybody, that now the #1 choice in the public, when they are asked to identify what our reason for going to war was, is oil. Everybody said that across all the political parties, all the regions of the country as well. But clearly now there's a strategic importance beyond that for the US to keep this permanent military engagement in Iraq. The US has seen its power, not just in the Middle East, but throughout the world, being challenged time and again over the past 10 years. You just need to think of the rise of Iran, most recently the rise of Syria, the new situation in Lebanon, the failure of Israel acting as the US proxy to cause any dent in the popularity and power of Hezbollah, and still the Palestinian resistance continuing to rise. It's quite clear that the US feels very, very worried about its position throughout that region, and therefore a continuing military presence in Iraq becomes a key strategic importance for it. And the long-term occupation means that we have to also work on a strategy of long-term resistance and long-term opposition from this country to that occupation. Because it seems that for all of our best efforts to try to hold to our original call for the troops to come out now, we do need to build this again into a stronger coalition and a stronger campaign to get an end to the occupation. And I just sketched 5 different ways in which we certainly hope to do that from War on Want. The first, and I think for us perhaps the most crucial, is to show support for the Iraqi forces of resistance within Iraq itself. And that's been War on Want's traditional response to imperialism, whether it was in Eritrea, in South Africa, in Palestine or Western Sahara. We support the Iraqi Federation of Oil Unions, which, as many of you know, is leading the resistance not just to the occupation in the south, but also to the oil law, which again has been forced on the Iraqi people to try to open up the resources of Iraq to BP, Shell, ExxonMobil and the others. And I'm sure you've all read on the current situation whereby now, for the first time, even though they haven't managed to get the oil law through, the contracts are already being prepared for signing with each of those different companies. We're also particularly concerned because the current Iraqi government is using anti-trade union laws from Saddam Hussein's era to put more pressure and to persecute members of the Iraqi Federation of Oil Unions. And we're particularly worried because we've heard of 8 of the members of the Iraqi Federation of Oil Unions, including 2 members of the National Executive, who have been forcibly removed from Basra and sent up to a refinery in Baghdad, where their lives are going to be in danger. And we are certainly taking up their case, not just with the government here, but with the trade union movement around the world. So firstly then, the support for the forces of resistance within Iraq. Secondly, for us, and one of the new features of the occupation which we're fighting against is, as Liz said earlier, this privatisation of the occupation. The fact that it's no longer just the US and the UK military and their allies, but a whole number of these private military and security companies. Some of them you know from the US, Blackwater, contract to be working in Iraq and corralling all of the different private military companies there. And others which have been involved in human rights abuses there. Erinis, another one linked with MI6 in this country, linked with the Litvinenko case. Erinis has been exposed recently on Panorama as a result of some of the work we were doing for, again, shooting at unarmed civilians simply because they came too close to the mercenaries' cars as they were going through in convoy. So we're pressurising the UK government to introduce laws to ban the use of these private military companies, these mercenaries, in combat situations. And I hope that before you go, you can take, there are copies of these on the back, where we've got actions for people in this country to hold the British government to account for allowing this to go on. 2002, the British government brought out its own green paper admitting there was a problem here with allowing these companies to operate unchecked around the world. We've made a lot of progress. We know they've actually drawn up a list of the consultation questions which would go to legislation, but we need to have more political pressure to make that happen. So I would really encourage you, as one concrete thing to do coming out of here, to pick up these materials and to send off the postcards in them. The third element which we want to focus on is justice for the victims of the occupation, and we're working with public interest lawyers, with Lee Day and other solicitors to try to support legal actions to take not just the British government but also these private militaries, these mercenary firms, to court and hold them to account. That is now possible in the UK as a result of this 2005 ruling of the European Court of Justice, which has said for the first time ever it is now possible to take action against UK companies in UK courts for abuses committed overseas. That wasn't possible here before. You may have read in respect of the Abu Ghraib torture case, where the US military have been brought before courts for that. The private military companies of Titan, which is now called L3, and Khaki, who were also involved, they've been scot-free on that until recently a civil claim has been brought against them in the States. Well, we're exploring the possibility of bringing similar civil cases against British military companies here. And again, that type of support work is one of the things which we're going to focus on. The last 2 bits. Fourthly, support for the Iraqi people themselves to rebuild their country on their own terms. We know that the country of Iraq was made to pay huge reparations after its illegal occupation of Kuwait. Well, why then shouldn't the UK and the US be made to pay similar reparations for their illegal occupation of Iraq? And we know, this time it shouldn't be through restructuring the economy or repairing the infrastructure via some cost-plus contracts to Halliburton and Bechtel, but genuinely giving the Iraqi people the right to do this for themselves, to use their oil resources for themselves, and to get the reparation money in from our side. That type of challenge, again, I think, highlights the illegality of the occupation and brings me on to the final point. None of this is possible unless we start from the basic premise of bringing an end to the occupation itself. And even though I've left it to the last of our points, it's clearly the first one we have to deal with. As I said, the end of this year is the end of the UN mandate for troops to be in Iraq. And the UN Security Council has said it will not give another extension to that mandate. It seems to me that that is a very strong case for us to be able to build an even broader coalition to say to the British government it is illegal and unacceptable for the troops still to be in Iraq. And although we would say the troops need to be out now, certainly that would seem to me to be an end time to get much broader groups of people involved to say the troops must be out there. We know that the UK and the US want to be in Iraq for the long haul. They're after the oil wealth of Iraq, they've made that absolutely clear. But we also need to be in it for the long haul in terms of our resistance and our opposition to the occupation. And I hope that you will